Welcome back to this i24 News Evening Edition. This is One-on-One, and tonight an exclusive interview with Reza Pahlavi, the son of the late Iranian Shah. Senior international affairs analyst Christian Malard spoke with him about the future of Iran, its nuclear program, and got advice for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Your Highness, what would be the first conclusions you would be tempted to draw from this new Iranian presidential election? Do you think that the international community is not naive to believe that they can change, reform themselves?
You know, it's a little bit to me like when some prisoners have their hour of recreation and they go outside to exercise, everybody gets a little bit excited that we're getting some fresh air. But in reality, they're still captive. It's a little bit life under the Islamic regime. A system that is irreformable with a supreme leader that at the end of the day decides everything. It really doesn't matter, therefore, who ends up in the post of presidents, because at the end of the day, the final call is made by the supreme leader. The rest is just an exercise to try to dupe, whether it's the Iranian community itself or the international community, into thinking that there may be some variations. Look, we saw the kind of variation even in the Soviet system, but at the end of the day, it was the Soviet system. Same thing with the Islamic regime. At the end of the day, it's a regime that has an ambition to export an ideology internationally. If they can do this under nuclear deterrence, even better for them, so they can impose their regional hegemony with no consequences. But the people in the middle of all this are forgotten.
Your Highness, you are telling me that whatever the president hears, the big boss is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme religious guide, who is holding the whole country with iron hands.
Well, it's been like this from day one. When Khomeini was still alive, before Khamenei became his successor, it was always the same thing. When millions of Iranians poured to the streets to support Mohammad Khatami the first time around, at the time they thought that maybe there could be a chance for reform. When somebody for the first time came out and say, I want a free and prosperous Iran, because the usage of the word Iran was forbidden, it was all about Islam. And then finally somebody said Iran, 21 million Iranians went there to vote for him. And do you know what happened when they demanded what happened to your campaign promises back in 1997? He cracked down on them and they were thrown out of their dormitory windows. And at the end said, I'm here to preserve the system. My point is this. It doesn't matter which one of these characters end up in the post of presidency. They are ultimately there to preserve the system that is the reason why people are in such a mess today. And most Iranians have understood that. But if there's no support for a real change, and I'm talking about a change of regime, not a change of characters, then we will always be in the same mess.
Do you think that this regime is capable of changing, of transforming himself and accept reforms? Or do you think that doing that, they will sign their own death?
If they were to concede to everything that the world expects them to be, they will no longer be the Islamic regime. Clearly. Let me just offer you one analysis. At the time we had a Cold War, there were two diametrically opposed worlds in direct conflict with one another. On the one hand, you had the Soviet Union with the international Marxist ideology, at war with the free world, free enterprise, capitalism, you name it, the US being, the counterbalance. However, wouldn't we agree that it was plausible that they could both coexist in a sphere of rational relations, to the point that they could even sign treaties between each other? You cannot obtain this with this regime. Let's understand this once and for all. The nature of this regime, for its survival, it has to defeat everything that stands in its way, which is, in essence, all the values that the free world as we know it stands on. Human rights, democracies, equalities, freedom of religions, equality of men and women, all of these values which to this regime are completely alien.
Do you mean also that on your nuclear negotiations, this regime is cheating, lying, trying to gain time, making the West believe that we can maybe find an agreement on the nuclear, and which will never be the case?
Of course, because look, if Khamenei is not stupid, this regime we should not underestimate their smartness. They know that if they were to concede on the first point, it will be the beginning of their downfall. I ask you this simple question. Would a regime that truly has no ambition other than using nuclear energy for, peaceful purposes, bring our country to this brink of economic collapse, where our real, our currency, has been devalued down to 80% of what it was last year, for the people in the country to face the possibility of foreign attacks just because we want to produce some kilowatts of nuclear electricity? Are you really willing to believe that? What are the true intentions therefore? They have never been transparent. They have never been truthful. There's a reason why the world doesn't trust them. But I ask this world, what do the Iranian people deserve to have? It is not their fault, because this regime has never been representative of them. And for once, I want the world to realize, if you leave it to the Iranian people and their true representatives, you wouldn't have the problem you're currently facing in the first place. And the only way you can obtain this is to help them overcome this regime and let them choose how their country ought to evolve.
We were talking about devastating impact of the sanctions imposed by the Western world to Iran. Do you think that could lead Ali Khamenei and the new president to have indirect conversation with Obama and the rest of the international community, changing everything, reshuffling the cards in the Middle East? And is it possible?
Look, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would still not solve the ultimate problem, because the problem is, how can you trust? If you truly have no problem but to concede and claim that you have no intentions other than peaceful use of the technology, why don't you open your doors? Why don't you show absolute transparency and round-the-clock monitoring of what you do? Of course, all the sanctions would have been then lifted. The point that I'm making is, every tactical stepping back by the regime has been a sort of tug of war. They're playing with you. They're playing with your heads. They're making you believe that maybe something goes to a breakthrough, but at the end they set back. Because once the regime, that's what I'm trying to say, once the regime commits to a setback, it's the beginning of their downfall, and they know that. They could have reached this compromise years ago. Again, at the time of Khatami, the world had given Iran a much greater deal that they refused then than what they were willing to give Iran in the latest rounds of negotiations. Much more. They rejected it then, at the time that there were no economic sanctions, at the time that there was not such degree of escalation of conflict. Why did the regime not take the offer then? And they could have really institutionalized themselves, from their point of view, of course, in a much greater way. The reason why they rejected then is the same reason they will reject it now and tomorrow, because they can't afford to do that.
When Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says that with the evolution of the situation with Iran and the nuclear threat, the Arab Spring revolutions, when he says that we are more in a logic of war than in a logic of peace, would you agree with him?
Well, I can certainly see the reason why the Israelis are frustrated, because the country they rely on it most, namely the United States, has always been the most naive when dealing on Middle Eastern issue, because there simply is a very superficial understanding of the countries and what's happening there. As such, if the status quo prevails, we are approaching a very dangerous red line. I understand that. However, what I say to the Israelis, as well as to the Americans or the rest of the international community, is that the best weapon you have for change are the people of Iran themselves in the first place. It's a nation that is fed up with this regime. There are people who want to be like you in the West, with the same values of freedom and self-determination and democracy and human rights. And they're being clobbered under a regime that is muzzling them and pretends that they are representing the will of the people. And you have to talk to us, meaning the regime. Why don't you once invest all your efforts on helping these people get rid of what has been the root cause of the problems at their own hands, as opposed to talk about war is inevitable, we have to go and preemptively attack Iran, we can't afford to have a nuclear Iran under this regime, etc., etc., etc. If you really mean what you say, then you might as well help the people of Iran overcoming. Why? Because it's far more legitimate because it's in their hands. It's far less costly in terms of financial and human lives being lost, and it's not destabilizing, which every other scenario would be, and would not lead, by the way, to a democratic outcome, which is foremost on our minds as Iranians.
Can yourself, Your Highness, and your Iranian National Council, which elected you as a spokesman, coming from all opposition parties, even the people who have been the farthest opponent to your father in the past, could you be a hope, an alternative to your country facing the situation? What would you do? I heard that you were calling for civil disobedience, but don't you think that the Iranian population globally is exhausted, and what can they expect?
The basis of this council started as a result of what happened back in 2009. We had long discussions with our political prisoners and dissidents as to now what. And we all agreed that since no structure from within Iran can openly challenge the regime, we had to have a platform that would advocate what is deeply on most Iranians' mind. The premise is simple. We claim that until we cannot hold free and fair elections in Iran, we will never be able to measure the will and the desire of our citizens. Now, the Council, the Iranian National Council for Free Elections, has for mission a simple goal, a campaign to obtain these rights in our country. In other words, forcing this regime to either voluntarily concede to this demand, or if not, then we have no choice but to have a campaign of civil disobedience to overthrow this regime and have the atmosphere for free elections after this regime. The choice is up to the regime and, in that case, the international community. Our demand, therefore, from the international community is that based on their own narrative, that's not ours, the 154th Assembly of the Interparliamentary Union has described the circumstances in any country whereby this situation has to exist in any country if you want to have free and fair elections. Now, and oddly enough, the Islamic Republic is signatory to this very same convention, but they are not, of course, implementing it. The question is simple. We demand this opportunity in Iran, not this mockery of elections as they call it now that we have, but in the true sense of the word, there's a direct correlation between what the world does proactively to support dissidents and human rights activists and Iranian Democrats, or, as always, stay behind, not take any position, and basically preserve the status quo. And of course they get deflated and they get depressed. So it's a direct correlation between active support or ignorance.
How do you view the future, the situation concerning Syria, Lebanon with Hezbollah, Hamas, and Israel?
Well, Iran has always been extremely hell-bent on protecting its biggest ally and avant-garde, as they say in French, which is Syria. A major change in Syria would be a very dire setback for the Iranian regime. That's why they are willing to fight over Syria more than they would fight over their own territory, mind you. That's how important it is to them. Declarations to that effect have been made by some highly placed official of this regime. Now, are they going to try to yet again fool the world in saying a few things here and there? I think your guess is as good as mine, and we are certainly going to be entitled to some, entertainment by the regime for a while. But then again, it's, as always, going to be the same old game, the same old false promises, the false hopes that it creates, be it for the Iranian people or for some gullible and naive international observers. At the end of the day, this regime and its nature is not going to change. It is getting more and more fragmented. It is dying a slow death. We all can sense that. But it's not going to find a miraculous cure because it is a cancer. And a cancer in anybody has to be removed. I think Iran is a country that suffers from cancer right now. The Iranian people want to live. They have to get rid of a cancer. And this cancer, until it remains in that body, you're going to have a sick patient who may even die. It's as simple as that from the internal prism. Now, the world is watching a country that should have been today the North Korea of the Middle East. But in reality, we have become the North Korea, a pariah, isolated. Do you really think that the average Iranian wants that as a reality? or wants to be like people in Belgium or in France or in the United States or even in Japan, modern, forward-going, free, stable? Or would they rather be the mockery of the whole world and be treated as pariahs, or the minute the word Iran is mentioned, they associate it with terrorism and radicalism? That's not what Iranians deserve. And Iranians have demonstrated their will to survive. They have demonstrated their will to resist. The problem is the world has ignored them for 33 years. They just wanted to negotiate with a regime that is irreformable. If that changes, then a lot more will change.
Your Highness, thank you very much.